Hello, everybody. My name is Beri Meric, co-founder and CEO at Ivy and the chapter chair of YPO Metro New York. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce all of you to Nell Watson. Nell, welcome. Hello. How are you today?
Thank you, Beri. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
It's so good to have you. We have a big and exciting topic in front of us. So to give everyone a little bit of context, we're going to be discussing the future of human society and social trust. And it's going to be a deep exploration of what are the key trends that are shaping our world right now, what can we learn about that context, and how can we make the best work of navigating the trends individually, organizationally, in our countries, and around the world. Nell is an ideal guide for this conversation. She is an AI faculty member at Singularity University. She's the chair of IEEE's Transparency Experts Focus Group, as well as the chair of ethicsnet.org and culturalpeace.org. So Nell, welcome once again. To kick us off, I thought it would be great to get your thoughts on the two competing visions for a future. Okay, let's say we take all of these incredible technological innovations that are in the process of flourishing. And let's say on the one hand, we make the absolute best use of them in the most humane, far-sighted, thoughtful way ever. Where can society go if we do that? And please paint for us a picture of if we fail to do those things, what could society look like? And that spectrum will hopefully allow each of us to see here what's at stake in this conversation and in the decisions that we're going to be making in the coming months and years.
Absolutely. The curves of better and worse possible futures are very divergent. Which one would you like first?
Let's start with the best that we can hope for.
Okay. Well, imagine a world where instead of the polarization and conflict and miscommunication that we have within society, suppose that machines were able to help us to translate better between each other. Today we have machines that can translate Mandarin into Swahili with ease and with relative accuracy. What if we applied those similar principles to helping people to talk across political boundaries, to cross along ideological lines, to be able to understand each other better? What if we evolved a world where we weren't just connected directly from our brains into the cloud, but that we were connected directly into each other, that we could perceive how our actions or our behaviors have effects upon other people? What profit would there be in wickedness towards another if you could feel it directly coming straight back to you with instant karma? I think we have a tremendous opportunity to build a peaceful society, one which is sustainable as well as efficient, one which manages externalities or spilled costs onto others in proper ways, which is a society that is equitable and peaceful and extends joyfully into the future. That's the opportunity that we have before us. However, there's also a tremendous chasm that we need to cross. We saw during the 1970s in particular, and into the early 1990s, how organizations such as the Stasi in East Germany had campaigns of Zersetzung, which means kind of like decomposition in German. And Zersetzung was used to target individuals, but not in an obvious way, not in a way that somebody knew that they were being targeted. However, mysteriously, their relationships would start to break down because somebody had spread rumors about them. They would start to fail in their professional lives for reasons they couldn't understand. Their children would become estranged to them. And they were so busy trying to understand what had gone wrong in their now chaotic lives that they could no longer be dissidents, that they could no longer stand up to someone's authority. We've seen examples of that in quite recent history. And with the power of algorithmic systems, with the power of AI to deceive us, with the plausible deniability of all of these emerging technologies and how they operate, there is an awful opportunity to do those kinds of tactics again, but 10 or 100 times worse, and to so many more people, not just a few hundred at a time, but potentially millions. And that is the worst outcome that we may be headed towards in the years to come. And so I think that one of the greatest questions of our time is, how do we use the power of these technologies in ways that are honestly beneficial and non-coercive and are least likely to take us into bad outcomes? I think we can do that through better ethics and through having better, more honest public conversations on what these technologies mean to us.
Beautifully said, Nell. Really appreciate that picture you painted. So on the one hand, we have this joyous, peaceful, highly empathic future where we are collaborating and it just does not, pay to be wicked, as you put it. On the other hand, there is this potential darker future where these technologies are used to control us, disrupt our relationships, and repeat some of the past mistakes that we've made with history and surveillance.
To solve for misery.
Right. So let's reflect for a moment before we go into the specifics of the different technologies at play here. What would you say are the key lessons of history? I mean, first of all, it's not like it's a finished story, but we did have totalitarian regimes that did have powerful technologies to control, not as powerful as what we have now. But we also had societies that managed to curb the use of these technologies. And so what's the primary driver here? When you made your comment about the negative world, it was very much the negative from a top-down perspective, whereas the positive was very much from a bottoms-up perspective and the individual. So share with us, what are the factors, what are the key lessons so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past?
Technology is itself value neutral. Any technology can be used for bad or for good purposes. A blade may be used as a scalpel to heal someone of a tumor. It may also, of course, be used as a shiv to make someone's day very unpleasant. I think if technology is applied in ways which are coercive, which are designed to force people or obligate them into something, whether that is overt or whether it is covert and deceptive, that's when things tend to go wrong. I think one of the most powerful disinfectants in our world is sunlight, right? Transparency is the #1 way that we can win a war against those who might wish to do us harm. If we can understand what is going on, and we can share that understanding with others, we have a much better chance of preventing bad actors from doing their thing. After that comes managing concerns of privacy, ensuring that we can uphold human dignity and that that isn't undermined by machines or other systemic or algorithmic processes, as well as looking at bias, ensuring that machines are mitigated as far as possible against any unnatural or unfair biases, particularly against protected characteristics, but perhaps against non-protected ones as well. And also that we keep people as maximally accountable as possible, that we know where the buck honestly stops, that nobody is set up as the fall guy or is left holding the bag for a horrible decision that somebody else in another place engineered. We don't want situations whereby somebody says, yeah, a bunch of people are probably going to die or their lives are going to be destroyed, but the cost of the lawsuit, that's going to be $20 million, not a big deal. That's not going to hit our bottom line too much, so don't worry about it. We don't want that kind of situation. We want a world which is accountable and where there is good justice against those who would wish to do others harm.
Excellent, Nell. So my key takeaway is transparency, privacy, dignity, inclusivity, and accountability are the things we drive for. We're going to come back to this once we dive into some of the very specific trends, and that will conclude the part one of this conversation, which will be you helping us learn what's at stake and what the key trends are. So the two key trends I'd love for us to start by focusing on is, on the one hand, machines and Internet of Things. On the other hand, digitization of the world. So let's start with the machines. So you say that machine intelligence, machine economics, machine ethics, and its confluence with the Internet of Things can, completely revolutionize how society is organized, and hopefully in a good way rather than a negative way. Share with us what's specifically happening today and what can we expect in the very near future, and what you see to be the opportunities and the challenges.
A lot of these emerging technologies intersect in different ways. For example, machine intelligence or blockchain or IoT or this emerging domain of machine ethics. They're all interesting in their own way, but once they are combined, they become so much more interesting and so much more frightening and exciting as well. For example, machine learning is often about things which are a little bit random, and often they have black box problems. So you can't necessarily easily understand why a machine made a decision, and the machine may not necessarily make the same decision again, given the same input. On the other hand, blockchain is very deterministic, and typically the things which are logged in the blockchain are very public, generally speaking. And so sometimes when we put these things together, they become more than the sum of their parts, because their strengths amplify and their weaknesses tend to be overcome. And so sometimes it's tricky to think of these technologies in isolation, because they are so much more important when put together. For machine intelligence, I'm very excited by the ability for the latest forms of AI to make sense out of chaos. So many different variables or permutations that exist in our universe are so complex and so chaotic that our mathematical models cannot make sense of them. We cannot engineer something that we barely understand ourselves. And yet machines can look at this. They can understand these hidden correlations that otherwise we would miss, or that we might feel on an intuitive level, but not understand why and not be able to rationalize. We just know it when we see it. Machines can help to uncover those kinds of patterns. And I think technologies such as generative adversarial networks, which can create all kinds of content dynamically, as well as the recent release of GPT-3 from OpenAI, which is worrying, but also very, very exciting. GPT-3, for example, is able to create all kinds of content, such as a text adventure, very dynamically. However, it can also be used as a search engine. It can also be used to translate one form of code into another, so say from Python into C++. It can be used to generate a dozen questions on US history for kindergartners and then answer them directly. And this is a step towards a more generalizable form of intelligence using essentially one algorithm. And that's one of the reasons why it's so exciting. And so really we are today on the verge of getting towards the true vision of what AI would be. We're moving away from just, it can do this narrow function very well, towards something that can do lots of things quite reasonably well indeed.
Excellent. So now if you fast forward on these trends, so what's at stake here? How does this help us? Or how will this potentially cause a reorganization of society? How can it be best used, in your view? The kind of the so what question, how would you answer that?
Right. Well, our civilization faces all kinds of stressors right? Whether that's climate, whether that's pollution, whether that's endocrine disruptors affecting our health, whether that's social decay, whether that's people not being able to understand each other perhaps as well as they once did. All of these issues stress our civilization, and there is a potential that some of those stressors may, in the end, some decade hence from now, be too much for us to bear. However, in a world of very complex and difficult, intertangled problems, machine intelligence may actually be able to help us to pinpoint the way out, to help us to find interventions that we otherwise could have never guessed or could have never found, as well as helping us to execute upon them in the most efficient way. And that's why machine intelligence could be the thing that helps to preserve civilization during the 21st century.
Got it. So it's potentially very potent solution to complex problems, right? Complex, systemic, whether it's environment, whether it's the markets, whether it's space travel, what have you. What about on an individual level though, right? Human to human, when I ask you to paint a picture of the bright future that's potentially possible, share with us how this can actually help individual rights, for example, in the face of, let's say, more negative forces, and also the way that maybe TV and photography allowed each other to, feel each other, empathize each other across borders. Like, where can this take us from an individual level, and how could that impact society?
Absolutely. Well, for example, you mentioned access to justice. So there are apps today such as Do Not Pay, which go through kind of a chatbot interface and ask you a series of questions about, like a personal injury you've had, or even just to help you out with some of the forms for a DMV application or a small claims court. And these kinds of things can be tremendously laborious, especially, of course, for people whose first language may not be the one the form is written in, etc. And so using these kinds of machine-driven techniques, we can make access to justice so much more accessible to more people more cheaply. And I think that's one of the best ways that society can be improved in the very near term. I also think that one of the best predictors of life outcomes is developing a bit of self-knowledge or self-awareness. Being able to understand the things that tend to get in our way. For example, you might be in a bit of a bum mood, right? Maybe you're not feeling so good today, or maybe you're a little bit frustrated with people or the world in general. And then you consider for a moment, wait a minute, I didn't eat today. I must be hangry or something, right? I'm going to fix myself a snack, and then maybe you feel better again, right? And being able to have that insight might make the difference between messing up a relationship with someone and avoiding that, right? And so if machines are able to preempt some of these issues that human beings get into, particularly in things like interpersonal relationships, health, etc., then we might actually have lives which are, again, less likely to have chaos in them, or at least that the chaos of the human condition might be slightly more easy to manage. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity, particularly in a time of so much widespread conflict and misunderstanding.
Fascinating. So this constant recurring theme of like reducing chaos, helping navigate chaos, and that could be the justice system, it could be the environment, but it could also be human emotions, your well-being, your relationships. So better awareness, whether it's the world around us or the world inside of us, all of this can help. So like I said, the second part of this is all going to be about the actions we can take. So before we dive into that, the other key trend that I'd like for you to guide us on is this trend of digitization. So on the one hand, you know, everybody thought, okay, everything will go digital, all the shops are going online and all that kind of thing. And then there was this kind of like a lot of e-commerce companies launching brick and mortar stores and so forth. Now we have a pandemic that shifted so much of business and interactions to digital. Tell us like what, like how the eventual outcome of this will be if so many things can be like quote unquote not material and still valuable. Where do you see this going? And again, maybe start with painting first a picture of like the very positive of like what this means, and then potential pitfalls of this as well.
I think in many ways, the wave of digitization is only going to continue and will likely increase. And you might have a non-digitized version of something which is sold for a premium, right? It becomes kind of an experience. The idea of drinking a coffee and reading a physical newspaper becomes kind of a premium experience, like something to really cherish rather than something standard. We're starting to see a real development within the Internet of Things. The first wave of IoT has been things like smart light bulbs or sensors that farmers leave in fields to tell them how much hydration there is in the soil, etc. But now we're starting to figure out that we can make IoT extremely cheap and extremely accessible through not needing electronics or batteries in it. For example, you can take a little tiny strip of metal and kind of a little strip, a little bit like a radio frequency ID tag that you might see in on many products or a library book. And if you touch two little strips of metal like that together, it actually changes how electromagnetism or electromagnetic waves backscatter. And you can tune it so that it works at about 2.4 gigahertz, which is sort of standard Wi-Fi radiation. And this means that you can detect an actuation, you can detect a movement in something. So for example, if you put two of these little strips of metal on a pill bottle, you can know how many times that pill bottle has been opened. You can put those two little strips on a little ball inside a fluid container and know by how many times that little ball has turned around, how much fluid has come out of that container and when, and also probably where, if you can triangulate from another source. And this doesn't require batteries, it doesn't require PCBs, it can be made literally for a cent or two. And that's what's going to change IoT. That's when IoT becomes totally ubiquitous, like just how almost every product has can have an RFID without any meaningful extra expense. We can do the same for the world of IoT. Everything can be connected to the cloud. And that means that so many things which are physical can start to become digitized or connected into the world of digital for the first time. We're also seeing the emergence of robotic avatars, which are controlled by human beings. So a little bit like a bomb disposal robot, except oriented towards doing other tasks, such as taking a virtual walk around a tourist location, or helping somebody out, whether that's helping them out with some domestic or care task, or whether that is doing maintenance or even a medical procedure on someone. I'm one of the judges of the ANA Avatar X Prize, which is a $10 million competition to build the most sophisticated basically robotic system or robotic avatar that you can put on head-mounted display, some haptic gloves, and inhabit, and then go and do meaningful work somewhere else in the world. And so this is going to be the next wave of telecommuting, right? Instead of a call center in another country, or maybe a developer in Ukraine, you're going to be having people going remote from one continent into another to do possibly a whole day's work. And this is also going to have ramifications on other geopolitical issues as well. For example, it's probably going to have an effect on migration, because one of the drivers of migration is a feeling of hopelessness, that somebody is stuck where they are and the only way for them to have a better life is to go somewhere else. But if they can earn decent money in another place and then bring that money home, then they have an opportunity to enrich their society in a way that they otherwise would not be able to do so. And they can stay with their family and support their family directly. And so this is where these technologies are taking us, to a world where we potentially have much greater opportunities for equity and participation on a global society.
Excellent, Nell. So you've given us a really great kind of landscape of where things are, whether it's Internet of Things, machine intelligence, digitization, and you've painted a picture of what's possible. In the second half of our conversation, I really would love to dive into what we can each do. So on the one hand, when listening to everything you're sharing, one could be tempted to say, okay, whatever will happen, and I'll just take it as it comes, right? And a bit more of a passive approach. There is also probably a more active approach, which is like, how do I actively engage with this? How do I actually take the disruption that's going to be caused by these technologies to elevate my personal life, my professional endeavors, and also my society at large? So with that hope, I actually want to take it in that order. So if you could start with, from our just individual personal lives, okay? Our family, our loved ones, our well-being, share with us like what are specific action steps, given what you see as coming up and what's at stake. What are key things that we can do to prepare and leverage what's going on, as opposed to, hoping not to be disrupted out of business or something like that?
I think one of the best ways that we can protect ourselves and others is by learning a little bit about cybersecurity on a basic level, kind of best practices, how to avoid getting phished, how to avoid getting viruses and Trojans and things onto people's systems, those kinds of things, as well as how to avoid being tracked less by various big tech companies. And I think if we can start to teach others, right, to teach our peers, to teach especially our oldest and youngest members of society these decent best practices, we can have a society which is a little more anti-fragile against the worst excesses of the use or abuse of technology. I think that's a good start. I think as well, educating ourselves on the latest possibilities with AI by, for example, direct experience. So, there's this really fun game called AI Dungeon. And I really recommend that people play it and check it out. By default, I think it uses GPT-2, which is the older version of the algorithm I mentioned earlier. I think you can also go premium to get GPT-3, which is like 20 times more sophisticated. But just by playing that, maybe even playing it with a friend, and you can do that, you can get a feel for where technology is right now, the mysterious power of machine intuition. And that can help to educate people as to the possibilities, be they beneficial or be they potentially less beneficial. I think those kinds of examples that people can directly experience of AI and similar technologies are going to make the difference.
Excellent. Thank you so much. For everybody listening live, in a couple minutes, we're going to go into audience questions. So if over the next 5 minutes, you could type your questions into the Q&A box, we'll be sure to get to that, hopefully all of them. So now, you mentioned these key areas: transparency, privacy, dignity, inclusivity, and accountability. Everyone who is participating in this conversation are leaders of organizations, businesses, agencies, and so forth, who actually have a lot of decision making and influence, how they can influence these. So let's talk about from a business and organizational perspective, but also as it relates to government and regulation. Let's maybe quickly go through these and into action items on each one. So you talked about transparency being key. Let's start there. What are the different ways in which in each area of our life, but specifically organizationally, we can embrace this, and since it, you know, and like avoid the pitfalls of, I guess, like an absence of transparency?
I think all of us can take steps to have a more transparent culture in organizations. Often people work completely in silos and people don't understand what people in other departments are working on. Maybe even people in the same room, they don't understand the things that they're working on. And that makes it much harder to have transparency throughout the organization. It makes it a lot harder to have accountability as well, to understand who's doing what. I think also that organizations should ideally, if they have the resources at least, to have some kind of an ethics officer at the highest levels of the organization that people can go and talk to if they have concerns. So sometimes, for example, somebody might not like how something is being done, but they get vetoed by their boss, their immediate line manager, who says, this is nothing to worry about, you know, put your head down, get back to it, and mind your station. I think if we had more opportunities to take honest ethical issues directly to the top of the organization in a fast way, from whatever level, whatever position, then a lot of these issues that we have with abuse of technology would start to disappear largely. And people wouldn't need to, you know, quit their company and be a whistleblower or something in order to finally get the word out. I think that's one of the best ways that we can start immediately. My hope as well is that frameworks such as ECPAS, ECPAIS, that I've been contributing to for the IEEE, I think those kinds of frameworks are going to be very helpful for assisting organizations in designing how they function on an organizational as well as a system level that they're building. I think those kinds of rule sets implemented well are going to be instrumental in creating safer and happier futures with AI.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Next one, you already started telling us from a privacy perspective, being more mindful to know where we're being tracked, maybe reduce the number of things. Any other organizational suggestions when it comes to privacy best practices for business leaders to keep in mind to stay ahead of the curve?
I think a lot of organizations now, if you visit their website and they get you get that little bar at the bottom that says we're using cookies, you know, and many of them just say, okay, and you click it and it goes away. But ideally, some of them are now saying, we want to use this data for X, Y, and Z, right? For keeping you better informed, for marketing, for making the system more powerful, etc. And that adds another level of granularity. And I think that kind of approach is going to be much better for privacy. Basically putting the user in control of exactly how and where their data may be used. And I think throughout the 2020s, we're going to start to see those kinds of choices of users start to be logged on things like public blockchains, so that there is a transparent, indelible record of what somebody agreed to or did not agree to. And that record may then unlock certain features or certain parameters within another system or not. And I think that's how we can start to kind of close the loop between privacy and ensuring that is actually actioned in the right way.
Excellent. Just one more, and then we're going to dive into the audience questions because there's some great ones. Accountability at all levels. How can technology be best leveraged to do this? And with a positive outcome?
People tend to trust decisions made by algorithms, sometimes a lot more than they ought to. People assume that if a machine made a decision or a prediction, that machines don't tend to be so fallible. And if a machine was fallible, surely somebody would have, fixed the bug by now. And this means that sometimes a decision can be made within a system that looks like it's made by a machine, but it might actually be influenced by a human. So you might actually have a human in the loop who is actually changing the impressions that a machine makes, and people think it's actually driven by machine intelligence, and yet it isn't. That's one way in which accountability can fail massively. And so it's important to know who is accessing what parts of a system and when, and all of those logs need to be very carefully maintained in an encrypted form. Accountability is also more difficult in a world where data can come from many different sources. So data might be in a pipeline going to another third party, and then other third party data is coming in. And from all of those flows of data, a decision is made, and that decision is unfair or outright incorrect. Who's responsible? Like, what piece of data ultimately caused that to happen? And I think we're starting to get new technologies, such as something called radioactive data, created by Facebook and similar approaches, which put kind of a little tiny alteration to data, not enough to change how it functions, but enough to give it a little tiny signature that can be tracked. Now, of course, that means you can better understand why a certain piece of data made a certain impression upon a system, but it also means it might be possible to track people through ways that aren't immediately obvious either, right? You can hide a lot of information in a steganographic process, a way of changing something in a way that most human beings wouldn't notice is different, but that machines can detect that pattern if they know what to look for. So there's always going to be a cat and mouse game of technologies being used to improve things, and then also being used to obfuscate things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, this has been great. I'm going to dive into the audience questions. Those participating live, please, if you have any other questions, submit them as quickly as you can. First one is from Robert Daniel, who asks and says, there are opportunities in chaos and randomness, be it personal growth or innovation of new products or ideas. How do we still protect the human condition and evolution in a world where AI streamlines your experiences or smooths out chaos?
That's a really good observation. Criticality is a property, for example, within physics, which occurs on the edge of chaos. If you think, for example, of a nuclear reactor, it being able to sustain a fission reaction is criticality. And that's on the edge of supercriticality, which would mean the reactor would explode, right? You got to keep it just in the right bounds in order for it to be effective. And I think it's an interesting idea that by ironing out chaos, we might have a world that is more banal, or has less spice of serendipity, shall we say. I think that's an honest criticism. Potentially that might happen. AI might help to make the world a little more bland, or a little more justified in a certain direction. However, potentially we could also find ways to mitigate that. We could ask AI to throw in something from left field now and then, right? To give us a little extra idea from outside of our typical sphere, perhaps, right? And then that might help to mitigate any kind of banal boringness from AI. So there's always trade-offs with these technologies, and also potential ways of getting around those trade-offs too.
Well, we may also not need to ask AI to throw us a curveball. There's a lot of thoughts and questions around killer robots, robots taking all the jobs. Tell us a little bit about your views when it comes to this. Because like you said, as much as streamlining chaos out, it could actually create tremendous chaos too. Tell us your view of like, in all the ethics related things that you're involved with, what do you think is the likely outcome with machines endangering our livelihoods or lives versus like you being confident that like we will be able to control for that?
I think there is likely going to be significant disruption within lower level white collar office jobs. So for example, basic web designer jobs, basic copy editor jobs, basic programming jobs, perhaps. All of these face disruption within the next 5 years or so. I mean, just from the examples that, for example, the GPT-3 algorithm is showing us now, I think there is going to be very significant disruption in many of those fields. There will still be a demand for people at the top end of the curve, but the lower level stuff will start to be automated more and more by machines. And we're seeing similar problems within law as well with attorneys. Because one of the ways that you traditionally get a good attorney is by ingesting tons and tons and tons of jurisprudence, like old cases. You know, in the movies when they open up the books and, you know, oh, there's this case from 1957 that, you know, that we can rely on to save the day. And honestly, a lot of that kind of work is now being done by machines. And it means that it's harder now for people entering the profession to actually get up to that level of proficiency, right? Because the machines have automated the basic stuff that they ordinarily would be given to perform. I think things like more manual labor is less likely to get disrupted. There's something called Moravec's paradox, which says that things like calculating big numbers or making sense of lots of data are things that machines are good at, and yet machines find it very difficult to do things that a human toddler can do, like navigate a room or understand speech or easily tell apart 3 different types of fruit necessarily. And so a lot of trades like, you know, engineering, plumbing, that kind of thing, I think they're much less likely to be disrupted. However, they will, to some degree, face a little bit of disruption from other humans operating via avatars from cheaper nations. So there is going to be a wave of disruption. However, there's also going to be new ways of educating oneself, new ways of training for new skills. I think a lot of these algorithms that I'm so excited by can be applied amazingly to training, helping people to coach themselves to be better in certain skills. And there will be a little bit of chaos. In the end, hopefully it will start to even out.
Excellent. Thank you, Nell. So we've got 2 related questions here. One is from Hugo Niley, who asks how to practically turn public blockchains into tools that promote and empower social justice and equality. Could public blockchains be the solution to dismantle excessive monopoly of governments and corporations and ultimately build a truly of the people, by the people, for the people system? And then Sarah Goffstein asks very related questions. What are some problems you anticipate with AI being utilized in a democratic society? Here, I'm assuming that the use of AI is not always going to be politically neutral. How do you recommend mitigating these dangers? So 2 different sides of the same coin. How would you respond to these?
Absolutely. Blockchain is definitely not a panacea, but it can be a very useful tool. Essentially, it's a great way of avoiding needing to have a trusted manager of data, right? You don't need to have a government necessarily that you have full faith in. If you have a blockchain, you can register a land deed to show that you own a farm. And it doesn't matter if your local mayor tries to destroy that record or alter it. You have a record somewhere that you've created that shows that, for example, a certain document existed in a certain configuration at a certain time. And so definitely we can use these technologies to improve accountability, to show what people did or did not agree to at a certain time. And also I think that they can be used to potentially create a more distributed form of democracy. So, for example, helping people to participate in local government more, to help people to make local decisions in ways which are more or less provably safe. Now, I would never say that any blockchain is uncrackable, because if a system exists somewhere, somebody will figure out how to break it. But they can at least be less crackable or less hackable than a lot of human systems that we have, which, let's face it, are not ideal either and often go awry in various ways. So yeah, I think we can indeed start to engineer a more participatory society through these technologies, and one that helps to keep bad actors away from doing naughty things.
Excellent, thank you. So back to your point about transparency there. Next question is from Michael Whiteside, who asks, which types of businesses do you see as the biggest winners and also the biggest losers with this upcoming disruption?
We've seen in recent years a disproportional benefit to those corporations that have been able to get first mover advantage on data-driven technologies, right? The big tech companies. The big tech companies already were sitting on tons of data. They had lots of smart algorithmic engineers, and they had massive data centers to run compute problems on. And so they've been beautifully positioned to make advantage of these technologies. And organizations that have had fewer opportunities are increasingly being left in the lurch. They're increasingly being eaten up in many ways by the big tech companies. It doesn't necessarily have to be this way. There's an impression that in order to develop new AI-driven systems that you need to recruit 6 PhDs from MIT or Stanford, and that's not the truth. There is so much powerful technology out there which is free, which can be trained relatively cheaply, and which honestly a half-decent Python engineer can probably knock together something in a weekend. It's all out there, it's all accessible if you know where to look and how to get started. And I think that there are some great resources we can use to find free data sets out there and bring those into the company. We can start working with companies like Labelbox and dBrain to turn the data that we have sitting around in company hard drives and get that tagged first by humans, and then training the machines later, having that tagging entirely done by machines. That's how a lot of non-AI driven companies or non-data driven companies can become a lot more capable and a lot more future-proof in a very short period of time, if they wish to. So we've seen a lot of disproportionate benefit to those in the fat head of a long tail, but I think the time is changing, and I think there's new opportunities for those that are willing to embrace it.
Thanks so much, Nell. Next question from Andy Strangeman, who asks, over the centuries, human nature has not really changed, even though technology has. What gives you the hope that it will do so by the way of current technological advancements?
I think many aspects of human nature are largely eternal, but not all. I think we genuinely do have human minds that are less traumatized by the world than they used to be, by the very nature of our societies being a little bit less trauma-inducing than they used to be. And that means that we have opportunities to cultivate young children in ways, for example, that are more loving, that are more compassionate. And that changes how people grow up and how they relate to the world. And I think that we can use technology to help to improve compassion with each other and to help understand the ways in which our past traumas may be causing our brains to act in certain ways. And having that kind of self-knowledge, or being able to work with an AI psychotherapist that's able to ask you some questions and you can genuinely release something, that changes people, that changes our minds, that changes how the world works to us. And it even changes entire networks of relationships. You see it sometimes when somebody, the prodigal son or daughter comes home and they've been away in the world and they've seen something different. And just by their presence, the whole network, the whole family, the whole clan changes slightly, usually in a good way. And so that's the opportunity that we have to work with machines to help to manage some of the problems of the human condition better than we've been able to before. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that with programs like WOBOT, W-O-E-BOT, WOBOT, which is able to listen to your problems and give you some tea and sympathy, as well as ask you some meaningful questions about it. And of course, it's relatively unsophisticated, but it's still very effective. And people feel so much gratitude towards WOBOT for just listening. That's going to make a big difference to how we live our lives.
Thank you so much, Nell. It was beautifully said. And I guess, yeah, we are a product in some ways of our environment. And if technology does change that for the better, it can change how we behave. So for the better, thank you for that. Let's spend only a minute on these remaining couple questions here,
Okay.
just because we're almost out of time. A great one from George Bergzelli, who asks, do we need to change anything in the global governance for AI and blockchain to ensure the technology is used in the most beneficial way? How should the governance look?
Ideally, it would be nice to have more international collaboration on these questions and these problems. And another issue is that there's a lot going on in China that a lot of people in the West don't necessarily know. They don't know about it, they don't hear about it. You know, people in China tend to read the papers in the West, but not necessarily vice versa. Particularly in things like AI safety and governance. There's kind of a bit of a curtain sometimes between different spheres of the earth. And it would be nice to have more, maybe like a international geophysical year of collaboration on AI safety. That would be great. I'd love to see something like that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nell. Here's a really profound question. With the pandemic, people are realizing to value human value and interaction compared to a few years ago. How do you see the impact of change in the people's mindset and machine AI and automation, given the impact of the pandemic and what that separation has made us feel like?
We've been forced, frog marched almost, to adopt a lot of these technologies faster than we otherwise would. Until very recently, even a lot of banks would have said, oh, a contract signed digitally, I'm not sure whether that's acceptable or not. You know, but the circumstances of these times have obliged us to adapt. I think in some ways that's good. It's probably pushed our adoption of technology faster. However, it's not necessarily comfortable to do things faster than we're prepared to do so. And I do wonder if our implementation of digital transformation is going to be done in an ideal way if we're forced to do it at breakneck pace.
Thanks so much. One final quick audience question from Michael Fagbero, who asks, where do you see blockchain technology and cryptocurrency headed? Blockchain seems to be relevant across different industries, but currency aspect looks to be a trend. What are your thoughts? And I thought this was particularly important given currency and financial systems are, it's a lot of the decision making nationally is dependent on that. So how do you see this?
Well, if we extend currency a little bit broader and consider it tokenization, tokenizing transactions, I think is a powerful way of increasing accountability for things like impacts on the environment. For example, if we have a more tokenized way of understanding how much pollution was created in a product, or understanding whether a product was successfully decommissioned again after the end of its useful life, or whether it was just dumped into the ocean. And we can track who owned that product and who made that product. Then we can kind of close the circle. We can bring accountability back to people that otherwise don't have it. And we can create a world that is more fair and more sustainable, but that uses these kinds of automated technologies to do that mucky work for us. I think that's one of the best outcomes of these technologies. And I'm trying to start a conversation on that idea at pacha.org, pacha.org, about how we can start to automate externality accounting, as I describe it.
Excellent. Now to wrap up, Edgar Fajardo got in there at the last second with an amazing question. So I want to combine just the concluding remarks in 1 minute. So Edgar asks, technology might have created more polarization in societies. How do you think current big tech companies should shift cultures and incentives to unite instead of divide? So that, and then together with that, if you could share with us how we can best support your endeavors, which actually pushes towards like positive nudges across companies and governments. And then if you have a final call to action for us to wrap up, that would be great.
Sure. I think the ongoing polarization and cultural conflict in our society is one of the biggest issues of our time. I think there's a lot more that companies, especially big tech or social media companies, can do to facilitate conversation between people, which is constructive, but without censoring. I talked about using machine translation before. What if, for example, you could scrub a negative tone out of a statement and retain the core essence of what somebody's trying to say, but without the nasty tint to it? That might enable people to have a conversation without getting freaked out. I also have a series of principles that I've put up at culturalpeace.org, where I'm trying to create something like a Geneva Conventions for the Culture War, or something like a meta rule, a set of meta rules around conflict to contain the worst excesses of it. That's what I'm hoping that we can do in these times.
Excellent. Now, this was such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for your guidance on a very complicated topic. You truly made it very human and accessible and easy to grasp. So obviously we're on this journey for years to come, but I do believe all of your insights will help us navigate much better than we would have on our own. So really appreciate it. Wishing you all the best with your endeavors, and we're excited to support you in every way that we can.
It's a pleasure, Beri. Thank you all for listening and your conversations.
Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you again, Nell. See you soon. Take care, everybody.